This is Life Worlds, the place where we explore life through other eyes and minds. Let's flip the script and discover how to orient your world around nature. I'm Alexa Firminish. Come join me as we get down and forage for fungi, stalk coyotes, draft laws for rivers, hum with beehives, sing bird language, and help beavers to dam again. Let these stories spark your reconnection to nature's multiverse. Learn how to bring ecosystems back to life, become an agent for other intelligences, and begin to see how you too are the sum of all life worlds. So Kris, welcome to the show. And, on the show, we talk about a bunch of things with really one of the central ones being the human relationship to other forms of life. And so, especially because I'm speaking to you, I want to encourage us today to be a little bit wild in our conversation and to be nonlinear and kind of unpredictable and go down strange paths and roads and see where the conversation takes us, because there's a lot about the kind of work that you do that is deeply philosophical and psychological as well. And I kind of want us to wade into that territory because you know it so well. And I think all of us have a lot to learn from you. So I don't know how that sounds, and if you're
No,
if
it
you're
sounds
game.
fine. It matches the state of my mind at the at the moment with so much going on that is
Yeah.
some of it's seemingly disconnected, but of course we know it's all connected. So I'm happy with that format.
Okay, wonderful. Well, if that's the case, then maybe let's see. I wanted to talk today, and maybe we'll just talk about it right now. The title of your TED Talk, which was "Let's Make the World Wild Again." I'm really curious to hear from you what you mean when you say wild, and what wild means personally to you as Kris. What does that word
Yeah.
mean to you? And then what does it mean to make the world wild?
Well, that's a really good question. And of course, when you use a term like wild, it's really hard to define it because just as the word implies, um, wildness can be found anywhere. It's in your mind. It's how you get up in the morning when you look out the window. What are you seeing? Do you see your human neighbors or do you see your non-human neighbors? How does it and where does it place you in the world? Are you a Christian who sees our dominance over the world, the non-human world, or do you see yourself amongst the many sentient beings on this planet? Um, it can mean a wild life full of adventure and sort of living on the line, so to speak. That can be in an urban setting, but in our lives, it's a non-urban setting. It's out in very isolated places and feeling that edge where your life depends on your decisions and the circumstances that you're in the moment, whether it's on a river or it's at many thousands of feet, whatever it is. And I like the intensity of what I think is a wild mind and a wild life, because I think it makes your life much more complex, even day to day, wherever you are. If you start to live as though all life depends on it, on the actions that you take and the way that you see yourself, but much more importantly, how do you see everything else? And so I think in my case, very personally, my life really became whole when I started with my husband 30 years ago, trying to restore areas and bring back species that had been extirpated in some cases for over 100 years. And how does that, what are the results of that? Of course, from a numerical standpoint, from an ecological health standpoint, but really, what does it do to your own head? So all those things come to mind when I think about the concept of wildness and our necessity as humans not to leave that behind, but in fact, take it with you wherever you are. You could be in Zurich, you could be on Mount Everest, but we should never lose our connection to that.
It's almost like we have a form of more infantile wild when our wildness is just a human cultural wildness. Let's have a wild night out or a wild conversation. But the
Right.
wildness that you're speaking to, it's a jaguar is back in a landscape after over half a century of not being there. And it's a participatory wildness in that larger story that surrounds us. And as you said, it's kind of on the edge. Like, it's not comfortable always, and it's not always feeling safe, and it's sensing yourself
Yeah.
at that borderline of being in a landscape where also there is something that could attack you, right? And generally these creatures don't, but it's just that sense of like something here is so whole and so much larger that your own sensitivities and kind of your own body picks up and wakes up. And I'm wondering, in some of the places that in Chile and Argentina and elsewhere where you've restored these millions of acres of lands and national parks, how did your wildness come out more through those interactions? Was it gazing at in the eyes of a macaw that had just come back to its sort of home, even though it wouldn't have been its home when it was born, but its ancestral home? Or what were those moments that you felt that wildness, that you saw it, that it was palpable for you?
I think when I first got to Chile in 1993, and Doug flew us in his small plane into where we would be living for the next 20 years, into a roadless area in the extreme south of Chile. I think that's where I really came to understand that I'll be damned, this is wild. I
But
had
you had the
retired
right
from
gear. You
Patagonia
had all the right
Company.
gear.
That's right. I'd
Clothing wise, you
retired
guys
from
must have
running
been set.
Patagonia Company.
Yeah,
I
totally,
know.
exactly. Yeah.
So this was from 2 days to the next. I retired and moved to South Chile in a roadless area. And as adventurous as I'd been over the years uh, at Patagonia Company, working and in my non-working hours, I was not prepared for the true wildness and isolation of the southern coast of Chile. That was wild. And so in the first year or two, you're just adapting and adopting to that isolation, to that. How do you organize yourself? There are no grocery stores, there's no nothing. You have to fly out to get anything that you need. So it's funny, but the terminology use of wild starts from the moment your urban mind is, I'm going to use the word assaulted, which is pejorative, but it's an assault.
Mm-hmm.
That you realize you have to be careful. You can't break your leg out here. Something that would happen to you in the city, and you can be rushed to a hospital. In these areas where we've been working the last 30 years, you have to be incredibly mindful that if something happens to you, the chances of getting out and having that kind of attention in an emergency isn't likely to happen. So these are all small examples of that transition from being an urban person and a businesswoman to working in impenetrable temperate forest. That's how we got started in the extreme south of Chile. So again, the sense of wildness is so multi-layered and circumstantial. And then finally, you really realize you are just among these beings who are out here just evolving as they always have in this case. And you start to identify with it. And it's not that you lose your habits of modernity or urban life, but they fade to the background, and you, in a way, step in to a world that is not really interested in you. You could be the CEO of Patagonia, but in the wild, you're just another thing that can be eaten or can get lost. Or and I really appreciated that. I have come to seek that out, to have that confrontation with the true world in a way that is incredibly humbling. And I'm really grateful that I've had these two extremes in my life, which very few people have, I think.
It's a massive dose of sort of ontological humility almost.
That's
And it does make me
exactly
think,
it.
right? And it does make me think. One of the and we'll get later into a conversation on what rewilding is and practically what it entails, but one of the big challenges in the rewilding movement and then the restoration movement, especially when you're bringing back certain keystone species or apex predators, it's that human domesticity that is not prepared anymore to accept and integrate, I think, these other forms of life around us. And so, I don't know if you've seen recently, but they're planning to cull a bunch of wolves in Yellowstone and other parts of the US again. And so it does beg this question of like, how do we prepare us? And I know that you've done activism in your work and a lot around communication, which is also why I ask this. Like, how do we prepare a society, and I'll say principally a Western society, and it shows up in lots of cultures in lots of ways, to to be ready to accept that kind of life again, and to be ready to accept that humility and that understanding that you're never safe, and it's just the hyper object of climate change that's going to come get you if it's not a cougar, right? And arguably
That's
one is more
right.
noble than the other. I'd rather have a, so how do we rewild a human civilization that is just
Mm.
so freaking far from that? And it's a big question. I'm not expecting a comprehensive answer by all means, but it is something that I spend a lot of time kind of thinking about.
Well, I think, as you say, it's the complicated question, and in every case, especially when you're, as we do, we're working with large carnivores, because we're trying to start with keystone species. In some cases, we started with species farther down the food chain, but and even those can be complicated, but nothing compared to the work we've done with jaguars, cougars, ocelots, um, the big guys who actually are quite safe, but nevertheless, just being a big cat puts you in the wrong
Yeah.
column. So, the number one thing is, if you're going to rewild, bring back keystone species, you have to first erase the reasons that they went extinct in the first place, because you never want to bring them back and then have them go extinct again. And this is, I think, to your point about wolves in the Northwestern Rockies. That issue was never really resolved legally and culturally. And so you have a species like the wolves who have been really successfully reintroduced. And in 3 states, key states, they're being shot, as you say, packs at a time, because the originating reason they went extinct in the first place has never been improved, at least in that specific region. So there's tremendous amount of work, the socialization of why to bring a species back, the economic benefits of local communities to see that that species comes back. You you become involved very deeply for a very long time in terms of local pride and um, and really finally, as I mentioned, the economic benefit of having a fully functioning ecosystem, which is the only reason we do this, is very evident. If you take Iberá National Park, where we are in northeastern Argentina, it's roughly 2 million acres of grassland and island forests. It's a vast wetlands. There are 10 communities around that wetlands, and to the one, they were all essentially ignored over the last 100 years, maybe longer. Small villages, small towns. And we knew that to reintroduce jaguars, cougars, ocelots, even giant anteaters, giant water otters, that we had to get those communities enthusiastic about it at first. And for years, the only work we did was to socialize the idea that the rock star of the province has the opportunity to come home. Now, in that case, in Corrientes province, where we work on this project, the Correntinos have always seen the jaguar as their spiritual uh, representation, so that it's been gone since the 1930s. Though people accepted it, they always mourned the fact that they were gone when their whole sense of self identity was a jaguar. So I won't go into all the details because we'd be here for a few days, but eventually the entire province became champions of bringing these jaguars back. The schools, all the kids with faces painted like jaguars in the parades. This is the classic socialization of really any subject. And it took us a long time to get the first jaguars into the breeding center, which was in the middle of our project. And then an even longer time to actually see them released and out into the wild. So there were years of anticipation, to the point where the people in Corrientes were saying, come on, get them released. We want wild jaguars. We don't want domesticated jaguars. But I won't underestimate how long it takes to socialize the return of a large predator. And today we have 8 jaguars in the wild, more to be released. And they are the point of pride for the entire province. So that's a long way around to answer your question of how that gets done, because it is everything. You can't
It is
be the
everything, and
one to
yeah.
be releasing jaguars into the wild. It has to be you on the technical side, but it has to be the political leadership. It has to be the kids. It has to be the churches. It has to be everybody on almost every block in every town and village that says those are our jaguars and we will protect them.
And
So
I mean, that's what's so challenging, because they're in, this jaguar was maybe part of their cultural heritage and almost the myth of the place. And I think that rewilding is often more
exactly.
challenging when it's maybe a less iconic species, or it's that story was so long ago, or it's just a few communities that hold it. I think also what your story really exemplifies is, even maybe above economic considerations, although maybe that's what helped onboard the process initially. You're speaking about the role of beauty, and you and I have spoken about beauty a little bit in the past, and I
Mm.
think that I'd be amiss if I didn't bring it up in this conversation, because you're talking about the way that some aspirational image of an ecosystem and of a culture gets revitalized, and that is an act of beauty, and these children in the streets and people painting themselves, and these are
Mm.
deeply celebratory acts. And they are not, I think,
Mm.
I mean, there's obviously probably lots of nuances to that kind of story, but it's not doom or denial or chaos, or there's another dynamic at play there, which is the evocation of aesthetics and beauty, of like, this will be a beautiful landscape, this will be a beautiful culture if we have these creatures back with us. And so I'm curious, throughout your life, and to whoever might be listening to this, who's designing a campaign or thinking about how to get involved in an ecological movement, and they know
Mm.
what they care about. I think we should talk about the role of beauty, because there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of desperation, there's a lot of grief. I know I can feel that very often. I just write poetry and try and
Mm.
let it pass through me that way. But what has been the role of beauty that guided your work, and I know also Doug's work, and where does that fit into your projects?
Mm. Well, I credit Doug with really um, training my eye and my ear and my sensibilities about beauty. I think all of us who are interested in the arts, and even within our companies and so on, and our private lives, you have a sense of what beauty is. I like it, I don't like it. Um, I like those colors. It's a very superficial sense of what beauty is to you. And really, through Doug, I began to understand what it was I was looking at, and how um, what does beauty really mean to us. And for me, I would say I've almost trained myself to think of it as looking at something in its absence rather than its presence. And today I look at beauty as something that's whole, that things are working, things are functioning. And sometimes you can't see that unless you start looking. It's almost looking for negative space in a painting. What is absent from this story? And what's the impact of that absence? And it could be a species, it could be really anything. Um, I'm a student of beauty now, and I think I'm 71 years old, and I will study beauty until the day I die, and hopefully after I'm dead, then things could get really beautiful. It is a You can sit in the same chair and look out the window and really think about what it is you're seeing and what's the iconography of the things that you're seeing. Is it an industrial model? And of course, there is beauty in an industry in a certain kind of way. But mine has become, and certainly Doug's was, the beauty when everything is present. The beauty when, I guess that's all I would say. When everything is present in an ecological system in this case, and
And I yeah.
it's a very deep, and I think endless well. I think you don't stop under growing, developing your understanding of what beauty is, the sort of perfection in terms of wholeness. I mean, I look at myself sometimes. I look at pictures of my face when Doug was alive, and I look at pictures of my face after he died, and you can see wholeness on one side and survival on the other side in two photographs. And it's
Mm,
maybe somebody else wouldn't see it, but I see it. And so
mm,
um, it's it's like a in my case, a third or fourth language, and you just
Oh
chip
gosh.
away at it.
Yeah.
It's like
I
learning
love
to
how
read
you,
ancient
yeah.
Greek.
You tracked the landscape of your face. Like you tracked your own world there and
Yes,
saw what happened when some keystone species of my life isn't there. It's so
exactly.
interesting. I've started writing this article. A tentative title is like Extinction is Loneliness, because I was reading about all of these
Mm.
deep time histories and um, relationships between these different symbiotic mutualistic relationships between certain flowers and certain pollinators, and they only release one kind of chemical for one very particular fly that its neighbor doesn't
Yes.
even produce, and that fly is coming in and it's 1 part per billion, but that scent calls that fly in. Or in the case of the ants that farm a particular fungus that creates a bacteria that's then on their skin that's then feeding the acacia tree. And these are relationships that have existed for hundreds of millions of years,
I
400 million
know.
years in some cases. We have a lifetime with a human being that we love, right? 40, 50, 60 years. These are
Right.
400 million years of relationality. And what happens if you're that flower and you send off your signal and no one comes?
Hmm.
And no one
And no
comes,
one comes.
right? Like that's extinction. It feels like it
It
must be
is.
so lonely to be the
Oh, I
creatures, as you
think
said, like beauty is, yeah, you know, it's like
it's
beauty is this
interesting to me
absence.
how
Yeah.
I think you're less than half my age, and how you have advanced your thinking on so many things at such a young age. How what's informed this? I'm sorry, but you're very unusual.
Loneliness. Lots of time alone with books. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and so
There's probably
and
some
obviously
truth to
that is
that.
beautiful, and yet and yet that absence of relationship is extinction. And the thing that
Mm,
concerns me the most, and that's why I think that your work is some of the most dignified and important work on this planet, is because if we don't have a baseline to understand what
mm,
wholeness is or can even be like, if the only forest that you've known is a fourth generation,
mm.
like tree farm, and
Exactly.
that's your definition of a forest or a marine protected area. It's a few fish swimming in an aquarium, or it's a greenhouse versus some kind of polycultural garden. If all of these are become our baselines, how do we know what to advocate and protect for, right? And so the fact that these millions of
Hmm.
acres of land will remain in some form of their state, because obviously they'll rely on creatures that are decimated somewhere else, so they're never going to be necessarily in an optimal state. But when we don't have those places, then there's no
Mm.
baseline for beauty, or there's no baseline for what the emptiness or the belonging is. And so that leads to a question I was thinking about. The model that you guys kind of espouse and created, how relevant is it for today when these large swaths of landscape are maybe less connected, less present, or are there still enough large lands that can serve as these bastions of life? And does the work even look different today? Let's say I pick up the work that you've been doing. How do I do it differently? Is there a different model or a different way
Mm.
of thinking about
Mm.
it? Even for honesty, we'll talk about economics later, but even for the economical context we find ourselves in.
Yeah. Oh, those are a lot of comments. Let me
Yeah.
uh, walk through them. First of all, I know exactly what you mean about the ecological baseline. I was diving in the Galapagos, I don't know, just before COVID. And I I'm in the water, I'm looking around, and I am absolutely dazzled by everything I see. And then I suddenly realize, is this a lot or a little? I have no idea where I'm looking in the curve of ecological health in Galapagos to its devastation. Am I at the top of the curve? Am I falling off the back of the curve? And it was an epiphany for me because I thought, Christ Almighty, I have no idea. It seems like a lot to me, but what do I know? This could be, and in fact, I ask a lot of people about this once I got out of the water, and hence, what was I seeing in the Galapagos? Was I seeing a lot or a little? And I was seeing, frankly, a little. That was such a good reminder to me that when I love being in Africa, when I go to Africa or any place I go, I think, "Oh, I'm seeing so much wildlife, but is it a lot or is it a little? Is this the front end or am I looking at the back end?" So I think having that tough conversation with yourself and reminding yourself that wherever you are, and it can be having to do with human suffering, doesn't have to be the non-human world. What am I seeing? Is this healthy? I need to know what I'm looking at. Okay, so that was the first thing.
Yeah.
The second thing, I think our work has changed tremendously over the years, even how we've looked at what we're doing. When Doug and I got started, we we were involved with the activist issues around the world and so on. But on the conservation side, we were really acquiring large tracts of land and donating them as national parks and seeing that that in itself was what we were trying to do, create national parks as we have seen in the United States. Where are they perfectly managed? Never. Are they protected? Yes. So it was only about 15 years ago when we started working in areas where there were a tremendous number of species that had gone extinct, mostly locally extinct. And we thought, well, wait a second, what are we doing here? National parks was never the goal. The goal was always to, wherever we work and before we leave properly functioning ecosystems. And so I think by and large, that's exactly what we've done. But in most of our work now, we have to go back in and reintroduce the keystone species that are missing, and work with local communities from the very first day, wherever we are. And so we're not in the national park business. What we're in the business of are these fully functioning ecosystems. And that was a sea change for us because it forced us to see all these national parks we created were just a strategy towards something else. They were not an end of themselves. So that was a big change. And we never tackled marine conservation to the extent we probably thought we should. But we were so busy with these other areas that we never focused on it. And not long after Doug died, I went to Sofia Hananen, who runs Argentina, and we ended up creating 2 no-take zones, the first of the country in the southern Atlantic in Argentina, huge territories of marine no-take zones. That was the first try, and now that we're doing that in both Chile and Argentina. And I serve on a body of issues that are outside the Southern Cone, the Antarctic Commission on waters off the continent of Antarctica and things like that. So besides rewilding, working very aggressively in the marine sector has changed our work quite a bit as well.
There's an interesting question there because when you create a no-take zone, well, let me say it differently. You spoke about fully functioning ecosystems, and as you pointed out earlier, you can separate the human, right, from what's happening. And I know that in a bunch of the projects that you guys ran in South America, you had ranches and regenerative farms and this kind of economic component.
Yes.
And the creation of a no-take zone obviously must be paired with some other formation of a bioregional economy or a bioeconomy, or and it's kind of interesting. Like traditional conservation and economic development have always been at odds, but they're not actually at odds. And it's only by enmeshing those two worlds together that we can maybe hope to protect ecosystems, because people need to make livelihoods from the
Yes,
land. At the same time,
absolutely.
um, the current form of corporatism and capitalism in today's form as it exists in the majority of companies. I'm not saying all companies. I loved how you call Patagonia, what was it, like an anti-corporation or something. So there are these kinds of renegades, but there's still a model of growth that doesn't suit a local bioregional economy structure. And so I'm curious, in examples that you've seen, how do we ensure that these places get further enmeshed into a human production system in a sort of very healthy, symbiotic way? Like, how do we become tenders to land again in this current form of economics? Is it possible, or is there an intractable conflict there that you're like, actually, capitalism must die? And again, I think that reading some of the activist pamphlets that you guys were sponsoring back in the day, um, but I'm curious about your thoughts on that today. Kind of blending the pragmatic with where maybe we'd like to be.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you that the vast majority of the seas, especially from 0 to 200 miles offshore, are carpeted with industrial fishing that is draining the seas dry of its wildlife. So um, that we're going for no-take zones is an act of desperation, because you're trying to work in the areas of the nurseries, and these are huge territories. It's much more difficult, I've found, than working in terrestrial side. It's much more political. It's much more, uh, I would say, greedier. So we decided to concentrate on no-take zones because most everybody is going for marine protected areas, which is multi-use, and really they break down into a state where the protection can be quite low. So we're a small team. I don't think we'll ever have to worry about cutting people out of their harvest of the seas. We hope that we have an impact on the industrial fishing fleets, which are really rapacious and
Yeah.
truly uh, very difficult to fight. So the question about the economic questions associated to conservation, to rewilding, um, if you if you look at where 90% of the real damage comes from in terms of economic development, it is within the globalized economy. I mean, I hate to sound like an old 70s leftist, which I wasn't. But the truth is, there are a very few number of people who drive the globalized economy. And yes, this form of capitalism is rapacious, but more clearly unsustainable, which everybody sees because it shows up in the form of climate chaos. It shows up in the form of the great extinction of species. But that hasn't changed anything. Even understanding that has not really forced people to change. You can have COP meetings after COP meetings, and the truth is they're incapable of moving, I would say, against the largest corporations, because sovereign states are subsumed by their economies, which are driven by people who are not leaders of those countries. And everybody knows this. This is not some great um, secret. And until, in my opinion, which I wish I did not have, until we really increase the level of suffering at a human level, we humans don't seem to be capable of changing our economic practices. And I get asked all the time, what are your thoughts about climate change? Do you think it's coming sooner than later? And it's very, I have to keep myself calm because I'd like to reach through and grab them by the neck and say, there are billions of people today suffering
Yeah.
from the outflow of climate change. If you go to the Sub-Saharan, if you go to the South Pacific, if you go to Louisiana in the United States, you will find crushing human suffering. And we don't calculate the non-human world suffering in terms of climate change. It's here, it's unfolding, and yet the wheels that drive this are very difficult to change. So when we do our work, it's all local and regional. I mean, we work with the heads of state of the countries we work in, of course, because that's what it takes to do a lot of this. But basically, you have to believe that your work, if your conservation work is going to last into the next 100 years, 150 years, you have to join in the evolution of local and regional communities and economies, because in the absence of their health, you can forget about everything you're trying to protect. So we can't, one can't separate themselves from those two facts. So it changes. So you were asking earlier, what's really changed about our work? This has really changed in our work. And we always worked with communities when we first arrived someplace, but now it's at a much deeper level in terms of what is their long-term health and what are the benefits from having conservation next door to you that will really stabilize these communities who have been very hard scrabble.
I think that the challenge with being like a student of things that collapse, and I remember one of our first conversations, you shared that you think a lot about collapse and civilizations, and unfortunately I have as well, and read some of those books that have occupied me in my lonely times. And yeah, it's humans change through beauty in a good day and adversity on bad days, right? And as you
Yes.
say, it is unfortunately the our historical record does have some sobering lessons to bear on what you just described, especially because those who have more agency, sometimes political, economic agency, are more sheltered from those immediate effects. So even just the question of like, is climate, then you're like, well, just go to these places. And
Yeah, step
something that
outside.
frustrates, yeah, seriously, something that frustrates me a lot in the sort of climate sustainability, impact investing, philanthropy movements, like all of these movements that are like, okay, we're doing something good. It is so incredibly anthropocentric, the conversation. And it's the reason for this
Mm,
podcast. It's like, if you take a deep ecology perspective, it's like all forms of life exist for their own intrinsic value. And as a human being, we can never
yes.
place a value in another form of life. They have every single right to be here, just as us. By the way, they are our ecological genetic kin. Like they are our family. If you go back far enough in time, they are. They have every single right to be here. And yet here we are in board meetings and decision tables, like, oh yeah, let's like allocate them this much space and do this much space. And kind of
Mm-hmm.
the slavery of nature. Sorry to use such strong
Mm.
language, but like we know what it's like to enslave humans.
Actually, I'm going
And
to
the
steal that
enslaved
from you.
yeah, no, please go
I
for
never
it.
thought about it that
It's
way.
visceral. It's visceral, but it's true. It's like nature is our, I don't know if this is political, nature is our slave. And that's why it's something that I'm passionate about is the rights of nature, because it tries to
Mm.
balance that, albeit an anthropocentric system. Um, but just the way that the climate conversation is still about human flourishing, right? And it's still about how can we as human beings get through this bottleneck? And it's like, no, we're only going to get through this bottleneck if we start to connect differently to other forms of life and understand that we're doing it for them and with them as our equals, or even as people who we're serving,
Mm.
right? And so that jump
Mm.
is probably too idealistic for most people to live, and yet I know that through direct experience of the living world and traveling to some, wild places, or even just hopefully
Mm-hmm.
something that's more simple, we can have a human civilization that starts to say, okay, I'm doing this for the trees, I'm doing this for the fungi, I'm doing this for the robins, I'm not just doing this for me. um and
Oh,
and
I think
something
you're
that I ask
absolutely
is,
right. Is
yeah,
it possible? Absolutely. There's no question. You have to decide, what kind of world do I want to live in? What side do I want to be on? And I think one response I have to what you just said is, you're right that when you talk about climate change, when you talk about um, the Greta Thunbergs of the world and the kids in the street and so on, the majority of people can't lock into that. They're worried about the things they won't be able to buy and so on. But I think we have to look at pushing forward in parallel. You cannot leave human communities behind because they happen to be living under circumstances, as Sir David Attenborough said at the front end of COP last month or a couple of months ago. The very people who are affected by climate change today are those who have no capacity to move out of the way, which is a huge point. You and I can move. Oh, it's getting too hot here, I'll go someplace else. They can't move, and they have no voice whatsoever. The fewer assets you have, the smaller the voice. And if you're living in territories around the world that are somewhat isolated, forget it. So we have to talk about climate and the extinction crisis on the human scale and the non-human scale together, and throwing it forward to not generations to come, but the very next generation, our grandchildren, your children. Um, it's here. I remember talking to the dean of Harvard Business School. This was before COVID, and I said, "You're preparing people at HBS as if everything's staying the same. It's not.
yes, yeah, that's a
You're
massive
doing
problem.
people a disservice if in the hallowed halls of HBS and other business schools and the finest universities, if these facts and circumstances are not, if you're not training them to get out there with all of their education and all of their privileges, and not fight against, work, instead of fighting against, work toward something that is not the world we live in today, you're at the caboose of the train. I know companies who do more than business schools in terms of changing their behavior and so on. And business schools, university, any institution of learning should be on the front end, should be looking out there and what's happening, and actively training, inspiring, motivating people to get out there and be the ones who will change the end of this story. So it's not a human world. It's not a non-human world. It is life. It is recognizing these people who have lost everything already and are on the move, trying to go north into Europe or wherever they go. That's if I stay awake at night, this is what keeps me up. I despair over the deafness of institutional entities in facing all these things.
Yeah, the inertia and the sort of entrenchment of interests, because people are able to live well for now in those kinds of settings.
Right.
It is
I mean,
incredibly
you and I
challenging, and I
live
think that
well.
the yeah, and I think it is truly this, this word compassion, because we're never going to affect change, I think, without some degree of empathy and compassion, even for those who we really
Mm-hmm.
struggle to understand.
Mm.
And that's going to lead me to a little bit actually back to the where we started, which was when you arrived at this dirt road and you're like, I'm going to be living here now. Like,
What?
what were the sensitivity? Yes. Okay. What were the sensitivities that you needed to develop as a human being to do your work well, you and Doug? What were those physical embodied capacities to sense an ecosystem, to understand what was needed, to work with the humans? Because I think we talk a lot about, like, strategically how we can do these things, and technically, and
Mm-hmm.
we can put show notes and things like that, or to how to do rewilding well. And I know you guys open source a lot of your work, but as a human being, as a person, and people in your team, like, what are the sensitivities that are required to do the work well, and what is it that the science can't tell you how to do, but that you go ahead and do it anyway? And maybe it's like
Mm.
counterintuitive, or like the tree told me to. Everyone has a kind of anecdote like that, and I think that we need to
Yeah.
demystify it and new age it, to just make it something that's actually very
Yeah.
practical. Like, we need a whole human to do this kind of work well. And so, you as Kristine, like,
Yeah,
how
it's
do
a
you
great
show up as a whole
question.
human?
I think to make it incredibly simplified, I think there are two kinds of uh, reactions when you start working here, or you work in Africa, or you work, I don't know, in the Arctic, wherever it is. First of all, like me, I arrived there and it was like a heroin user abruptly having no heroin
Stark.
to inject into your veins. Yeah, I went to a place that had an airstrip for our planes, no electricity. It was 1993, so no internet, no phones. So I had my own psychological, almost physical withdrawal. I didn't speak, even though I grew up in California. We lived in Venezuela as kids for a while. I spoke really Anglo Spanish. So I couldn't really work with anybody because I didn't have the language yet, and I lost my sense of self in social circumstances, because you sit at a table, everyone is speaking Spanish, and you understand it, but by the time you form a comment, the
I've
the
been there. Yeah.
the the conversation has moved on by a mile. So the first 2 years, I would say, I was working, and I don't know who could see what in my reaction, but it was tough. I went from being the CEO, being in Paris a few months a year. It was just a very different lifestyle. And fortunately, madly in love, and that worked out well. Most of the people who work with us over the last 30 years are they came with a very different coat of fur. They're biologists, veterinaries. They knew exactly what they were after, and they came to us to work with us because there weren't many opportunities like this around for them. And most of them have been with us for at least 20 years now. And these are people who are they're highly educated, but they are dedicating their lives to bring back jaguars and to everything we've been talking about for the last hour. So the one thing Hillary Clinton said that I really, really agree with is that it does take a village to create anything. And in our case, so much of what we've done is sort of the Doug and Kris show, when it couldn't be farther from the truth. We are truly a team. And as I said, many of us have worked together for a few decades. And you have to want to push back against the, you're not trying to roll the clock back. I think actually that would be easier. Oh, I'd like to go back to a simpler time. I'd like to go back before all the jaguars were extincted. We're trying to push the clock forward. We're trying to jacklight territories that have been severely and biologically important, but by and large ecologically trashed, push that forward much faster than it might, or perhaps not at all, evolve. And that takes people who are relentless. We just had a large fire in Ibarra. It burned 400,000 acres. And
I saw that it was a fire in a wetland, which is just
yeah, the
terrifying,
wetlands.
right? Because
it's terrifying. That's where
wetlands on
I'm headed
fire.
in a few days to go back down there and see the team. So 60 of our people were fighting a fire for 2 weeks on the front lines, really almost no tools. And our jaguar breeding center, everything was at risk. And these people just stay, and they hold to task. They are completely committed. So where does that come from? I don't know, but boy, they show up, and you're just thankful they do, and they stay. Now that we have jaguars back in the system since the 1930s, you can so easily take that for granted. Oh, jaguars are back. The red-shouldered macaws are back. But underneath that statement lie years of work with these extraordinary people, teaching macaws to fly again. Didn't know how to fly. So anyway, I know we're almost out of time, but I just would sing the praises of the people who do this work.
As you rightly should. And I think a lot of us long to be able to make a physical act to defend the things that we care for and love for. Not to say that I would necessarily choose to fight a fire, but I think that the act of defending other species is, especially during a time of crisis like the one we're living in, a deeply validating experience that a lot of people almost long for. They want to be on the front lines, you know? And
we have a lot of volunteers who come.
Yeah. And we met through one of your volunteers.
That's right.
Through Frank. So he's here
Lucky
with us right
us.
now as well. Yeah, he's here right now. Something I try and ask guests if we can get around to it is there any particular species or creature or landscape that has brought you a life lesson? And I think I ask this question because when we hear these examples, it can open us up to seeing something anew. And so is there a particular animal or place that has taught you a fundamental life lesson, something about whatever it may be, right? Like courage, sadness, strength. I don't even want to put the words in your mouth, but
yeah, I would say the red-shouldered macaws. It was audacious. I was really not in favor of trying to bring them back because they'd been gone for 150 years. And it was very hard to find individuals at all. They had to come from Europe and all over. And when they arrived, they were fat, didn't know how to fly, didn't know what to eat, didn't know how to crack things open with their beaks. And they were just a shadow of who they actually were. And the team who taught these birds to fly, they didn't know what a threat was. What's a threat? So puppetry, using puppetry, attacking a macaw puppet, and all the macaws sitting up in the cage screaming and crying because this wild cat is attacking a puppet macaw. And through that, this is months of training. So then they begin on, oh, if we see something that looks like this, then we have to fly away. And today they're flying in the wild, they're breeding, they're having chicks in the wild. I think we have 13 of them out now and many more to come. That told me that we are all deeply capable of being self-realized at any moment in your life, whether you're young or you're 85 years old, that those inherent, beautiful instincts that we have as sentient beings never blow out. We always have them. I'd
That's
say
a
those
wonderful
guys.
story. It's like if the macaws can make it back into the
Yeah,
landscape, we can too, right? I
that's
didn't
right.
know there's actually a person who made an electronic, like a mechanical device that is puppetry for birds to
It's
be
puppetry.
reintroduced back. That is, I didn't
Teaching
even know
them
that kind of stuff
what
existed.
to
Yeah.
eat. What are the trees in the forest where
Gosh.
they'll be released? What are the nuts and fruits they have? You have to go harvest those. And then and teaching them how to fly from A to B, but not flying in a straight line. How do you move your wings so you can fly through the middle of trees? I mean, this is months and months of
God.
training each bird so that they have the chance to be free and realize their lives and bring that species back.
I feel like you should be
So,
training the macaws in one part of the land, and the next door you should be doing the human training, or like, all right, guys, this is how you make a fire. This is
well,
how
I feel
you
like
make
I
a
have been
shelter.
trained. I
And
may
these two,
be,
it's like a movie. I can see these two things happening at once. It's like the human
we
training
have
and the
so much
macaw like
video
trying to
on this, and
fly.
when
That's
you come
brilliant.
down, you'll see
Yeah.
something that is a marvel. It is.
Oh my gosh. I cannot wait. Kristine, blessings. I know that thank you so much. I know that when we started the call, you were
Thank you.
just maybe having a slightly, I don't know, challenging emotions as many of us probably are. So thank you for being here. I love the
No,
conversation.
thank you for having me.